She woke up in her favorite chair, but didn't know her name, only the dog at her feet seemed to remember. Without warning, he dragged her through forgotten streets, where strangers wept and whispered secrets she couldn't place but somehow felt written in her bones. Each stop shattered her nerves, each memory clawed its way back, until one name made her heart stop cold. Someone had been feeding her lies for years, hiding behind a smile, erasing her life piece by piece, and now she knows who it is. He's still out there. He knows she's remembering. And this time, he won't let her leave. The town librarian, Miss Marie, couldn't yet know that Evelyn, once her most brilliant volunteer, had been declared legally dead in secret. Harold, the retired watchmaker, had no idea that the document Evelyn signed under sedation was a power of attorney handed to Norrie. Daniel, the boy-turned-whistleblower, certainly couldn't realize that the very man who forced him into hiding had become Evelyn's daily companion. It all began with the way the morning light pushed itself gently through the time-worn lace curtains in Evelyn's parlor, laying out long golden lines across the floor like a memory trying to reach her from across the years. The light didn't knock, didn't ask permission, it just came in soft and quiet, as though it knew she wouldn't mind, and maybe even needed it. And the room, well, the room was as still as an old photograph, the kind you find in a shoebox in the attic, where the faces are smiling but you can't name them anymore. Evelyn sat in the same armchair she always did, the one with the broken spring on the left side and the knitted cover her sister had made before the war, and by before the war, she couldn't say which one anymore. In her hands, she held a porcelain teacup with a tiny chip in the rim, filled with tea that had long since gone cold, untouched, and unnoticed. Her hands trembled just slightly, as they had every morning for the past several years, though today the trembling carried something else. Not fear exactly, and not weakness either, but a strange kind of searching, like her body was asking a question her mind couldn't quite form. The calendar on the wall still read March, though the days had long since slipped past that. She wasn't sure how many. The radio wasn't playing. The clock had stopped at 4:17. She wasn't sure if it was morning or evening anymore. That was happening more often these days, like her life was a story someone else had written, and now she was skipping pages without meaning to. Every drawer in the house had sticky notes, keys go here, your daughter's name is Rachel, the dog has already eaten. Some of them she obeyed, some of them made her cry, and others she didn't recognize as her own handwriting. But Rex never changed. The big German shepherd with the strong back and the eyes that had watched her more carefully than any doctor ever could, he was the only thing in her life that hadn't gone soft around the edges. Every morning, without fail, he sat by the door with quiet patience, tail thumping once every few seconds, ears perked like he was waiting for an announcement. When she rose, slowly and with the groans of old joints, he didn't rush her. When she forgot why she'd put on her coat, he nudged her gently toward the porch. That morning, something different happened. There was a letter in her mailbox, sealed in an envelope yellowed around the corners like it had been waiting too long. The handwriting on the front was elegant and deliberate, the kind of writing people used to learn in school, when penmanship meant something. There was no return address, and the postmark was smudged, as though time itself had tried to hide where it came from. She opened it slowly, tearing the flap like it might break in her hands. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper with 7 words written in blue ink. There are still places that remember you. No name. No explanation. No instructions. She stared at it for a long time. A really long time. Long enough for the shadows on the floor to move a full inch. And when she looked up, Rex was staring at her, not like a pet, but like a soldier waiting for the signal to move out. Something in his eyes told her, and she didn't know how, but she knew, that he had seen this coming. That maybe he had even been waiting for it. She whispered, more to herself than to him, "Is it true, boy? Do they still remember me?" Rex didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just turned, walked to the door, sat down, and looked back. The next morning, without any prompting, without even remembering why exactly, Evelyn found herself dressed and standing on the front porch, note in her coat pocket, shoes tied for the first time in a week. Rex was already waiting by the gate. He had something in his stance, not excitement, not urgency, but certainty. Like he knew the road they were about to walk was one she needed more than she understood. They walked in silence for some time, past the grocery store she hadn't been in since they stopped playing Sinatra on the speakers, past the post office with the broken flagpole, past the street sign with her maiden name scratched into the paint by someone who still remembered when these roads were unpaved. It wasn't until they reached the little park on Carter Hill, the one with the cracked fountain and the bent swing set, that Rex stopped. There was a bench under the crooked oak tree, and an old man sitting there with a cane carved from cherrywood. His hair was snow white, his hat was the same style they wore in '54, and when he looked up, his whole face lit up like he'd just seen a ghost he missed every day of his life. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, voice thin but full of something that hadn't cracked yet. "It really is you, Evelyn." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The man tapped the bench beside him and added, "Do you still remember the summer you taught me how to carve my name into that old tree?" Rex lay down at her feet, his eyes never leaving hers. Evelyn didn't sit right away, not because her legs ached or because the morning breeze had turned colder than expected, but because something about the man's voice unlocked a room inside her mind she hadn't visited in what felt like decades. Her hand drifted slowly to the bench's back, fingers grazing the smooth wood worn down by time and weather, and she looked at the crooked oak beside it with eyes that searched not for clarity, but for permission to remember. "I think I do," she finally said, the words slow and uncertain, as if she were borrowing them from someone else's story, and maybe, in a way, she was. "There was a boy with a chipped tooth, always carried a pocketknife his father gave him, swore he'd be famous one day." Her voice trailed off, but the man's eyes, deep-set and shining, filled in the rest. He leaned forward, elbows on his cane, not smiling now, but waiting, like someone afraid to breathe in case the moment disappeared. "You told me names mattered," he said softly, his words almost carried off by the breeze that rustled the leaves above them. "Said that carving your name into wood wasn't about pride, it was about saying to the world, I was here, and I did something good." Evelyn nodded slowly, though she still wasn't sure if she was agreeing or just trying to hold on to the thread before it slipped away again. She sat down beside him, not quite close, but close enough to feel the warmth of another human presence, and for a few moments, they just listened to the birds calling to each other like gossiping neighbors across a fence. "Jimmy Holcomb," she said quietly, after a long pause. "That was your name, wasn't it?" He let out a breath that was half laugh, half sigh, and looked down at the hands that once carved his legacy into bark now too thick to show it. "I still carry that knife," he said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a little piece of worn-down history, the initials, J.H., scratched into the handle like a promise he'd never broken. "When I was lost at 19 and thought about ending it, I pulled this out, looked at what I'd carved, and remembered what you told me, that the world needed one more good man with a steady hand." Evelyn's eyes brimmed, but the tears stayed where they were, proud and still, not yet ready to fall. "I don't remember teaching you all that," she said quietly, "but it sounds like something I would have done, back when my mind knew what it was doing." Jimmy didn't argue or try to make her feel better, he just sat with her, letting the truth settle in without pushing it one way or another. That was the thing about the past, she realized, it didn't need to be whole to be real. It just needed to be witnessed. They sat a while longer, talking about the oak tree, the old fairgrounds that used to stand just beyond the hill, and the time she'd yelled at the mayor for cutting down too many trees near the schoolyard. With each story, Evelyn felt less like a stranger in her own skin, and more like someone returning to a home she didn't know she'd left. Rex, who had been lying patiently, suddenly stood up, ears twitching toward the path that wound back toward town. He didn't bark or pull at the leash, just looked at her the way he always did when it was time to move on. Evelyn patted Jimmy's hand, still strong despite the years. "Thank you," she said softly. "For remembering when I couldn't." Jimmy stood with effort, wincing a little as he leaned on his cane. "You saved me once," he said. "Least I could do is help you find your way back." Then, as she turned to leave with Rex beside her, he called out one last time, "Do you remember the little girl with the red coat who used to follow you around like a duckling?" Evelyn paused, hand on the iron gate, and the question floated behind her like the tail end of a forgotten melody. "Her name was Lila," came a voice from behind the gate, soft as cotton but certain like winter wind across the plains. Evelyn turned slowly, not startled but curious, the way someone turns when a song from long ago plays faintly across a crowded room. There stood a woman no taller than 5 feet, hunched slightly, dressed in a powder blue jacket with silver buttons that shimmered just enough to remind Evelyn of Sunday dresses and porch swings. The woman stepped forward with the kind of grace only earned from a life lived fully and felt deeply, and as she reached the gate, she rested a gloved hand on its rusted edge like she'd done it 1,000 times before. "Lila McHenry," she said again, her voice trembling slightly now, not from age, but from the weight of what she remembered. "You used to call her Little Lila, because she wouldn't let go of your apron strings, not even when the bell rang for school." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, not because she was tired, but because she was trying to see what the woman saw, the image of a tiny girl in a red wool coat, boots too big, always one step behind. "Lila," she whispered, and something flickered in her mind, like the glow of a match in a dark room, not enough to see clearly, but just enough to keep her from being afraid of the dark. The woman nodded slowly, tears already gathering behind her smile. "I'm Lila," she said, "and I've been waiting a long time for you to remember." Evelyn stepped back slightly, not out of fear, but wonder, the kind of wonder that only happens when the past reaches out and touches your shoulder with warm hands. "You used to braid my hair on the church steps," Lila said, "and you taught me how to sing loud even if I sang wrong." Rex stood quietly beside Evelyn, tail low but alert, as if he too understood that something important had just stepped back into the circle of her life. "You told me I was worth something," Lila continued, her voice shaking now, but not breaking. "When my mother died, and folks said I'd end up running wild, you told them, that girl's got light in her yet." Evelyn stared into the woman's eyes, still struggling to see the child inside, the one with the red coat and a heart wide open. "Did I really do all that?" she asked, her voice brittle, full of awe and disbelief, like a sculptor unsure whether the hands that made something beautiful were ever truly her own. Lila reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph, old, grainy, creased right down the middle, of a little girl sitting on a bench with her head resting on Evelyn's shoulder. "You're the reason I went to college," she said. "The reason I teach now. Every time I help one of my students find their way, it's because you once helped me find mine." Evelyn took the photo in her hands and looked at it for a long time, her thumb brushing lightly over the faces like she was reading a language she had once spoken fluently, now returning to her one word at a time. "I don't know how I lost it all," she said, the tears finally spilling, not from sadness, but from something heavier, something holy. "But I'm glad you held on." They sat down together on the bench beneath the oak, two women whose lives had once touched in passing and now touched again, more deeply for the time in between. Lila told her stories of chalkboards and playgrounds, of the day Evelyn taught her to stand up to a boy twice her size, stories Evelyn didn't remember, but somehow believed more with every telling. And when the sun had dipped just low enough to cast the bench in shadow, Rex stood once more, this time with a more pointed gaze, looking toward the far end of the path that curved down toward the riverbank. Evelyn stood slowly, holding Lila's hand a moment longer, and said, "Thank you, sweetheart, for carrying the light." As she turned to go, Lila called out one last time, her voice cutting through the hush of evening like a bell through morning fog. "Do you remember the man with the pocket watch who used to wait outside your door every Friday afternoon?" Evelyn paused, her breath catching on the edge of a memory just out of reach. "That would be me," came a voice from the shadows near the fence post, slow and weathered like river stones smoothed by time. Evelyn turned toward the sound, heart beating just a little faster, not from fear but from the kind of anticipation that rises only when something long buried begins to stir beneath the surface. The man stepped into the light slowly, revealing a tall frame bowed slightly by age, dressed in a pressed wool coat that had clearly seen better years, but was worn now with quiet dignity. He held the pocket watch in his palm, not as if to show it off, but as if it were a part of him, something that lived closer to the skin than most memories ever dared. "I waited every Friday," he said gently, "just like clockwork, pardon the pun, because I knew you always walked home the long way after school let out, and I figured if I waited long enough, you'd stop and say hello." Evelyn stared at him, her eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in deep thought, like someone trying to identify a melody from the first few notes. "You used to stand under the bakery awning," she said, more to herself than to him, her voice distant but slowly sharpening. "You always had a newspaper in one hand and a lemon drop in the other." The man smiled, his teeth slightly crooked, but his joy straight and unmistakable. "Evelyn May Holloway," he said, as though he were repeating the words of a hymn he had memorized long ago, "you were the first person I ever wrote a letter to, and the only one I never had the courage to send." He stepped closer, slowly, respectfully, and she saw it then, the boy who used to trail 2 steps behind her, never speaking much, always holding that same battered notebook and watching the world like it owed him an explanation. "I'm Harold," he said. "Harold Beecham. We went to school together, and for about 30 years after that, I kept waiting for the right time to tell you that I loved the way you spoke your mind, and how you always had chalk dust on your sleeves because you stayed late to help the slower kids." Evelyn blinked, tears forming again, not just from sentiment, but from the strange weight of being remembered in such exacting, gentle detail. "I never knew you were there," she whispered, even as the truth of his words began to settle into the folds of her memory like the first snow of winter, quiet, undeniable, and strangely warm. "And yet, I think part of me always felt someone was watching out for me." Harold chuckled softly, the sound rough around the edges, but still young somewhere inside. "I never interfered," he said. "Never wanted to change your course, just wanted to be near it. I figured, if your shadow ever fell across my feet, that would be enough." He held out the pocket watch now, letting the sun strike the gold casing, and Evelyn saw an engraving she hadn't noticed before, "To E.H., in time." "I bought this for you," he said, "the day you graduated. I had it wrapped, with a bow and everything. But when I heard you were moving away to take that job up north, I didn't have the heart to hand it over. So I kept it, wounded every Sunday, told myself if I ever saw you again, I'd give it to you in person." She took the watch with both hands, cradling it gently, like it was made of something far more fragile than metal. "It's beautiful," she said, voice trembling now, not from confusion but from understanding. "Not everything lost is gone, and not every delay is a mistake. Sometimes, life saves certain moments for when we're finally ready to feel them." They stood there for a long time, not speaking, just breathing in the quiet that settles only between people who have waited patiently for the same memory to come back home. Then Rex, ever the sentinel, shifted his weight, eyes fixed on the far road that curved along the ridge behind the trees. His ears twitched, and his tail gave a single, measured thump. Harold looked down the road and nodded toward the distance. "Are you still in touch with the young boy who used to sell you peaches on Market Street?" he asked, his voice full of something that wasn't quite suspicion, but carried the faintest thread of worry. Evelyn turned her head slightly, the name already forming somewhere beneath the surface of her thoughts, waiting to be called back. "His name was Charlie, wasn't it?" Evelyn said slowly, her voice almost lost in the rustling of the trees above, like a thought trying to push its way through too many closed doors. She stared down the road Harold had pointed toward, eyes narrowing not in confusion, but in that deep sort of concentration old farmers have when watching clouds roll in, measuring time by the shape of what's coming. Charlie. Yes, she remembered now, the peach stand on Market Street, set up just outside the railway depot every Saturday morning in the summer, where a freckle-faced boy with sunburned cheeks and 2 short sleeves would shout about his peaches like they were buried treasure. He couldn't have been more than 10, maybe 11, but his voice had the certainty of a preacher and the charm of a carnival barker. Evelyn had bought fruit from him every week, not because she needed it, but because something about that boy made the world seem a little more honest. "I remember he had a limp," she said aloud, mostly to herself, but Harold was listening, and so was Rex. One leg dragged just a little behind the other, like he'd grown too fast on one side and couldn't quite keep up with himself. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes not from joy exactly, but from recognition, from a piece of the past clicking into place after too long in the dark. They walked together, Harold and Evelyn, following the curve of the road while Rex trotted slightly ahead, never pulling too far, but always guiding with purpose. The sky had deepened to that soft afternoon blue, the kind that holds the scent of cut grass and distant cookouts, and in the breeze there was the faintest trace of peaches, not real ones, perhaps, but the kind the mind can summon when the heart needs to remember something sweet. The orchard came into view just beyond the ridge, smaller now than it had once been, with more weeds than rose, but still holding its shape, the bones of the place intact, like a memory that refused to die. There was a figure in the field, bent low, pulling weeds from between the roots of an old tree. As they got closer, Evelyn could see the back brace, the crooked gait, and the same two short sleeves, only now stretched across the shoulders of a man who had grown into his promise, but never lost his fight. "Charlie?" she asked, her voice barely carrying across the field, but somehow he heard it. He straightened slowly, wiped his hands on his trousers, and turned with a smile so wide it nearly undid her. "Well, I'll be," he said, limping toward her with open arms, his eyes bright with that kind of boyish light that time doesn't always manage to dim. "Miss Holloway, or should I say Miss Ever Predictable, always asking for the ripest peach that still has its blush." They laughed together, and even Harold chuckled, though he'd never met Charlie before. Some laughter doesn't require introduction. "You used to read to me," Charlie said, after the hug and the catching up had given way to sitting beneath the shade of a tree. "Out loud, right there by the crates, when business slowed down and the sun got too high. You'd bring a book in your bag, something with cowboys or ships, and I'd sit cross-legged like a little fool and just listen. You made stories sound like they were meant for me and me alone." Evelyn blinked away the tears that threatened to come, not out of sadness, but because the feeling of having mattered, even when forgotten, is more powerful than any sorrow. "I didn't know they meant that much," she said, her voice soft. "To be honest, I didn't think I did enough." "You gave me words when I didn't have any," Charlie replied. "My father didn't read, and my mother didn't stay. You were the first person who ever told me the world was bigger than this town and that I had the right to see it." They sat a long while, talking about seasons and storms, about the price of peaches and the sound of trains on quiet mornings. Evelyn felt the weight of memory pressing in from all sides, not as a burden now, but as a presence, strong, steady, and deeply alive. As the shadows began to stretch and Rex stood once more, signaling it was time to continue, Charlie walked them back to the edge of the orchard. "You've still got a long way ahead," he said. "I can feel it. There's more waiting for you, more people who remember what even you forgot." He paused then, and his face grew serious. "But Evelyn," he asked quietly, "do you still talk to Norrie? The man who always brought you coffee after church and claimed to know what was best for you?" Evelyn stopped in her tracks, her breath catching just slightly, as if that name had landed with more weight than expected. "I still see him, sometimes," Evelyn murmured, the name Norrie still lingering in her mouth like something too sweet or too bitter, she wasn't sure which. As they left the orchard behind, the sun hung lower in the sky, casting long, slanting shadows that stretched across the road like memories unwilling to stay where they belonged. The name had triggered something, not a memory exactly, but a sensation, like hearing the first few notes of a song and knowing you once danced to it, even if you've forgotten with whom. Norrie had been around for a long time, longer than most men cared to hang around someone like her, opinionated, sharp-tongued, not always warm but never unkind. He showed up at church every Sunday like clockwork, always in the same gray sport coat and faded red tie, with 2 coffees from the diner and a folded newspaper under his arm. One for him, one for her, no sugar, splash of cream. She didn't remember asking for it, but he always brought it just the way she liked, or maybe the way he liked to think she liked it. They never courted, not really, not in the way folks used to talk about it. But he was there, birthdays, funerals, the odd Wednesday when the roof started leaking. Always there, always helpful, always right, or at least, insistent. Evelyn used to tease him about that, about the way he had opinions on everything from window frames to world affairs, and how he said it was his God-given duty to protect her from making foolish decisions, though he never seemed to doubt his own. The little white house with green shutters came into view just past the Methodist cemetery, nestled beneath two large poplars that leaned toward each other like old friends whispering secrets. She hadn't been here in a while, not since the Sunday she forgot to show up and never got a phone call asking why. Norrie didn't beg. He didn't chase. But he noticed everything, and his silence could stretch longer than most men's speeches. Rex slowed near the walkway, sniffing the air with that low growl in his throat, not hostile, but uncertain. Evelyn placed a hand on his head, gently, and said, "It's all right, boy. We're just visiting, not staying." The door opened before she could knock, as if he'd been standing behind it for hours, or maybe days, waiting for something he didn't know how to ask for. Norrie looked older than she remembered, thinner around the cheeks, slower in the eyes. But the moment he saw her, something flickered, not just surprise, but the deep kind of relief that comes when a missing puzzle piece finally falls into place. "Evelyn," he said, his voice as gravelly and low as ever, but quieter now, less sure of its power. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten this old fool existed." She stepped forward, not quite smiling, but not cold either. "I forgot a lot of things, Norrie," she said. "Doesn't mean they didn't matter." He stepped aside to let her in, and the scent of pine cleaner and tobacco filled the air, just like it always had. His home was orderly, almost obsessively so, every book aligned, every cushion fluffed, every photo in its place. That had always been his way, control the space, and maybe the rest would follow. He poured her coffee without asking, 2 sugars this time, and she noticed. "You changed it," she said softly. He paused, smiled faintly. "Just a guess," he said. "People change." They sat in silence for a while, the clock ticking gently above the mantel, each chime a reminder of time past and not always well spent. "Why didn't you come find me?" she asked eventually, her voice firm but not accusing. "When I started slipping, when the memories started going dark, where were you?" Norrie looked down at his hands, clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white. "Because I wasn't sure if I was helping, or making it worse," he said. "I thought maybe if I stayed away, it'd give you peace, or space, or something. I didn't know how to be needed without being in control." Evelyn sipped her coffee slowly, the bitterness grounding her. "You always had all the answers," she said. "Even when no one was asking the questions." He chuckled, then sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from carrying more than you should have, longer than you meant to. "And now," he said, looking up at her with tired eyes, "I don't even know the questions anymore." Rex stirred, ears perked toward the window, his body turning slightly. Evelyn noticed it too, a shift in the light, a sound from the road, something waiting just beyond the hedge. She stood slowly, setting her cup down with care. "There's more to this walk, Norrie," she said. "More people, more places that remember me, even when I didn't." He nodded slowly, standing to walk her out, and just as she reached the door, he placed a hand on her shoulder, not to stop her, not to hold her back, but just to feel her there, solid and real. "Evelyn," he asked quietly, "do you still have that little cedar box? The one your father gave you after the accident?" Her breath caught, and her hand reached instinctively for her coat pocket, but of course, it wasn't there. "It's buried under the floorboards," Evelyn said quietly, the words forming before she even understood what they meant, her voice steady but touched with the hush of something sacred. The memory came back not in a flood or a flash, but in fragments, the grain of the cedar wood, the way her father's hands smelled of engine grease and pine soap, the soft creak of the attic ladder beneath his weight. They'd stood in that attic just 2 days after the accident, the one no one spoke of in detail anymore, not because it wasn't important, but because some griefs live in a room by themselves and lock the door from the inside. She had been 17, or close to it, and the world had shifted on its axis in a way that left her dizzy for years afterward. Her father, a quiet man with tired eyes and a heart like a worn leather Bible, had handed her the box with no fanfare, no speech, no explanation, just a look that said, "This matters," and then he turned away. The box was simple, cedar, smooth to the touch, with a brass clasp and no key. She remembered holding it to her chest for hours that first night, as though it could anchor her to the world that had just tried to spin her off. Over time, she had opened it, slowly, cautiously, and inside were things that made no sense at first: an old postcard, a rusted key, a black and white photo of a woman she didn't recognize, and a folded piece of paper with handwriting she didn't yet understand. It wasn't until years later that the meaning began to rise, quiet as steam from a kettle. "I put it under the floorboards," she said again, more to Rex than to Norrie, though both listened. "Back when the roof leaked and I thought I might lose everything. I figured if I had to start over, I'd at least keep something safe." They turned off the main road and headed toward the house her father had built with his own two hands, a modest place with chipping paint and a chimney that leaned slightly to the left, like it was tired of standing so tall. The driveway was overgrown now, the path uneven with age and weather, but it was still her house, still her history, even if parts of it had grown silent over time. Inside, the air smelled of dust and time, with just a hint of lilac, her mother's scent, long since faded but still clinging to the curtains like a whisper. She walked the hallway slowly, trailing her fingers along the wall as if trying to remember the laughter, the arguments, the slammed doors, and the gentle goodnights. Rex followed close behind, paws soft against the worn floorboards, tail brushing gently against her skirt. She climbed to the attic carefully, each step deliberate, every creak a voice from the past. When she reached the top, she knelt in the corner where the boards had always felt a little looser, a little warmer, as if the house itself knew to guard what was hidden there. With her bare hands, she pulled up the plank, revealing the cedar box, untouched by time, the brass clasp still shining faintly in the low light. She sat cross-legged beside it, hands trembling not with age, but with anticipation, the kind that comes only when one is about to open something they once closed for good reason. Inside, the contents were just as she remembered: the postcard from Oregon, the key with no door, the picture of the mystery woman with eyes just like her own, and that folded note with the same elegant handwriting that had once sent her a message: "There are still places that remember you." Only now, holding that note again, she realized it wasn't the first time she had seen it. The handwriting, it was the same as the envelope from the beginning of this strange journey. And that meant someone had known, all along, where her memories lived. Rex growled gently, low in his throat, as if sensing something she hadn't yet caught. Evelyn looked around the attic, scanning the dust-covered shelves, the faded photos tacked to the rafters, and then she saw it, half buried beneath an old blanket, a shoebox with her name on it, written in black marker, and the date, April 4th, 1971. She opened the box, slowly, reverently, and inside were dozens of letters. All addressed to her. None of them opened. And all of them signed. N. She stared at them, fingers trembling now in earnest, and turned to Rex. "Do you think he was the one watching this whole time? The one pulling the strings?" Rex didn't move, didn't make a sound, but his eyes, those ancient eyes, didn't look away. "They weren't all written by him," Evelyn said softly, her voice almost lost in the stillness of the attic, though every word dropped like a stone into deep water. She sat back against the wall, cedar box open beside her, the stack of unopened letters resting on her lap like the weight of 100 lost conversations she never got to have. Rex lay close to her side, his head on his paws, eyes unblinking, watching the room, not with fear, but with something far older and deeper. She held one envelope up to the light, not to read it, but to feel the thickness of the paper, the way the ink pressed slightly through to the other side. The first few letters had indeed been written by someone familiar, the penmanship careful, exacting, even affectionate in a way that reminded her of Norrie's clipped speech and persistent manner. But there, about halfway down the stack, the handwriting changed, subtly at first, like someone trying to mimic another's style but not quite pulling it off. The loops were just a touch wider. The spacing between words grew more uneven. And the signatures, well, the first few had said, Norrie, plain as day. But the later ones were simply marked N. I should have seen it, she said aloud, more to herself than to Rex. I should have known that Norrie wouldn't write like this, not in this voice, not with this charm. She opened one of the later letters slowly, carefully pulling back the flap like peeling away an old scab. Inside was a folded note that read, in the most elegant script, "You have always been more than they understood." Her breath caught, not because of the words themselves, but because they sounded like something whispered to her in dreams she couldn't quite remember. And then she saw it, tucked behind the last envelope, almost hidden within the seam of the box, a smaller note, not in an envelope at all, but folded once, sharp and clean. It read, "You won't find him where you expect. But he has always been watching. Always." Evelyn sat in silence, the attic thick with a kind of air that felt heavier than the dust it carried. She'd spent so much time thinking she'd simply forgotten, that age had taken the pieces of her life one by one, scattering them into the wind. But now, she wondered if someone had helped them scatter, not out of malice, perhaps, but out of something even more dangerous, control disguised as care. She remembered, with sudden clarity, the way Norrie had always been there, always nearby, always helpful, but never quite open. The way he'd steer conversations away from certain topics. The way he always knew just a little more about her affairs than she'd ever told him. And most of all, the way he had reacted when she mentioned the box, not with surprise, not with curiosity, but with a tension that hadn't belonged in a man just asking about an old keepsake. Rex stirred, his head lifting slightly as if he, too, had come to the same conclusion. Evelyn rose slowly, her knees aching in protest, but her purpose sharper now than it had been in years. She gathered the letters, tucked the box under her arm, and made her way down the attic steps with the careful grace of someone carrying more than wood and paper, someone carrying the weight of truth finally pulling into the station. Outside, the sky had shifted again, that golden hue giving way to a softer blue, the kind that falls just before the shadows stretch long and lean. She walked down the porch steps without looking back, Rex at her side, the wind at her back. By the time they reached the edge of town again, the diner lights were just flickering on. And there, like he always was, sat Norrie, at the window booth, 2 coffees on the table, folded newspaper to his left, tie slightly askew. She stepped inside, box in hand, and sat across from him without a word. He looked up, startled at first, then, still. Like a man who had just realized the rain was coming and there was nowhere left to hide. "I found the letters," she said plainly, placing the box gently between them on the table. He didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. "I only wrote the first few," he said, his voice lower now, not from shame, but from exhaustion. "After that, he took over." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, heart suddenly louder in her ears. "He?" she asked, though she already had a name forming in her mind, one she hadn't spoken in decades. Norrie looked down at his coffee, stirring it once, then twice, then slowly lifting his eyes to meet hers. "Do you remember Daniel?" he asked. And in that moment, the air in the room seemed to still completely, like the past had walked through the door with its coat still wet from the rain. "I remember Daniel," Evelyn said slowly, her voice drifting like smoke across the space between her and Norrie, each word a step deeper into a memory long buried beneath time and silence. She didn't need to close her eyes to see him, the face came back sharp and vivid, like a photograph that had never faded no matter how many decades had passed. Daniel had been the kind of man folks talked about in whispers, not because he was dangerous, but because he was different, too sharp for a small town, too quiet for the kind of world that expected men to speak with their hands or their fists. He carried books in his back pocket instead of a switchblade, read poetry under the bleachers during lunch, and had once returned a wallet he found outside the bank, though no one had seen him take it. He had a mind that didn't know how to sit still, and eyes that seemed to see people not for who they pretended to be, but for what they were trying to hide. Evelyn had loved him once, not in the way stories often tell of dramatic affairs or forbidden embraces, but in that slow, steady way a tree loves the earth that holds its roots. They were young, too young, perhaps, but there was something between them that never needed to be spoken aloud. He had plans to leave town, to study abroad, to do something that mattered, and she, despite every warning from friends, teachers, and even her own weary mother, had believed in him with a faith she'd never given to anyone else. Then, one spring morning, he was gone. No goodbye. No letter. No trace. The town said he'd run, some claimed it was the law, others whispered about gambling debts, a few suggested madness. Evelyn had waited for weeks, walking to the post office every day with hope in her chest and silence in her hands. But nothing came. Not then. Not ever. Until now. She stared at Norrie, her hands folded neatly beside the cedar box, her gaze fixed and unflinching. "You knew something," she said. "You knew something back then, and you said nothing." Norrie shifted in his seat, not with guilt, but with the heavy discomfort of someone whose secrets were beginning to spoil in the light. "I didn't lie," he said carefully, "but I didn't tell the truth either. Because I thought I was protecting you." Evelyn shook her head, slowly, her voice low and cutting. "You don't protect someone by stealing their story. You don't protect them by deciding what they're strong enough to hear." Norrie reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, old, worn, the seal broken, the paper inside folded and refolded until the creases looked like wounds. "This was the last letter he wrote," Norrie said. "He left it with me. Asked me to deliver it when the time was right. I never did." Evelyn took the letter in trembling hands, the weight of it almost unbearable, not because it was heavy, but because it was the final thread between what had been and what could never be again. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear the paper, and began to read in a voice just above a whisper. "Evelyn, if you're reading this, then maybe I wasn't the coward they said I was. Maybe someone let you see the truth, finally. I had to leave, not because I wanted to, but because I was told if I stayed, something terrible would happen, not to me, but to you. I knew things. Saw things I wasn't supposed to. About people with names that still sit in church pews and smile like nothing ever happened. I left to protect you. But it broke something in me. I never stopped writing. I never stopped watching. And I never stopped loving you." She folded the letter with reverence and placed it back in the envelope, her hands resting on it like a prayer. Norrie sat silently, unable to meet her eyes now. "He came back once," he said. "Just for a night. He asked if you remembered the song you used to sing to him, the one about stars and promises. I told him I didn't know. He left before morning." Evelyn stood slowly, the strength in her legs returning as if the truth had filled in something hollow. Rex rose beside her, alert, protective, faithful as ever. She reached for the cedar box and turned to Norrie one last time. "Do you know where he went after that?" she asked. "Where Daniel disappeared to?" Norrie didn't speak at first. Then, with a voice barely audible over the hum of the diner lights, he said, "I think he's still close. Closer than you think." "He never left," Evelyn whispered, the words forming like mist on her lips, as if her mouth had known the truth long before her mind was ready to believe it. The diner around her seemed to fall away, soundless and slow, like a photograph darkening in a tray of developer, revealing something too painful, too personal, too long concealed. Norrie didn't nod, didn't speak, didn't confirm, but he didn't deny it either. That, more than anything, told her what she needed to know. Rex moved beside her, his body low and still, eyes watching not the man across the table, but something behind him, something beyond the window, something only he could sense. Evelyn turned, slowly, her body moving like a clock wound with care, and followed the dog's gaze out into the dusk where the streetlights buzzed quietly and the sidewalks bore the prints of thousands of shoes that had come and gone. Across the street stood the church, small, worn, its steeple casting a long shadow across the gravel lot. And beside it, barely visible beneath the awning near the side entrance, was a figure, still as a statue, yet unmistakably real. Evelyn stood, the cedar box held close against her ribs, and crossed the street like a woman remembering the weight of her own name. The man didn't move as she approached, didn't raise his hands or speak her name. But there was no need, the curve of his shoulders, the silver at his temples, the way his right hand trembled ever so slightly when the breeze stirred the hem of his coat, all of it told her that time had passed, yes, but time had not erased him. She stopped just short of the steps, her breath catching in her throat, the moment as fragile as glass and just as dangerous. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely above the hum of the streetlights. He looked up then, slowly, and though the years had written their story across his face with the usual ink, lines, where, distance, there was something unmistakably young in his eyes, something that had never changed. "I waited," he said simply, and there was no apology in his voice, only sorrow, and something stronger beneath it, hope. "I thought you were dead," she said, her voice cracking in places she hadn't expected. "Or gone forever, or worse, that I had imagined it all." He stepped forward one pace, just enough to close the air between them. "I was told to leave," he said, "by someone who said they loved you enough to protect you from what I'd uncovered. And I believed them, not because I trusted them, but because I trusted you would be better without me." Evelyn opened the box slowly, her hands calm now, her heart no longer beating with fear but with clarity. She showed him the letter, the photo, the key, and the note she now understood had been sent not from a stranger, but from a man who had never stopped watching, never stopped remembering, never stopped loving her from the shadows. He reached out, fingers brushing hers, and for a moment, just a breath, just a blink, the world stilled around them. "There's something else," he said, his voice growing steadier now, as though he'd been rehearsing it for decades. "Something I didn't know until recently, something I need you to see." He led her behind the church, through the garden gate where roses grew wild and a single bench sat under an old willow. There, hidden beneath the stone border, was another box, not cedar, not worn, but new and clean, as if it had been placed only days before. He opened it carefully, revealing a stack of documents, photos, names. "These are the people who made me leave," he said. "The ones who threatened you, who stole from the town, who used me as the scapegoat to cover it." Norrie knew. He played along. Said it was for your good. Maybe he believed that. Maybe he didn't. But the truth has been buried long enough. Evelyn stared down at the names, men she'd known her whole life, some now gone, some still walking Main Street with polished shoes and handshakes for every voter. She looked up at Daniel, and in that moment, the long arc of her life, all the forgetting, the silence, the aching questions, curved back into something whole. "I remember everything now," she said. Daniel took her hand gently, and together they sat on the bench, the light fading around them, the dog lying between their feet like he always knew this day would come. "So what happens next?" Daniel asked. Evelyn looked out over the garden, her heart no longer lost in time but firmly planted in the present. "We tell the truth," she said. "We tell it all." And somewhere deep in the fading light, a single church bell rang, soft, slow, and sure. Because the past, when faced, doesn't have to haunt you. Sometimes, it sets you free. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.